though doesn't appear to serve any purpose other than to maybe blur my words, we're also live streaming this, so I have to speak into the mic. And anybody who asks questions at the end of the session also has to speak into the mic, even though it doesn't really appear to be serving any purpose. But at least that's what, unless Chris is having a horrible joke on all of us, that is the purpose of this. So I'd like to welcome everybody here today, and for a great talk. I'm sure it will be a great talk from Eric Kaliner, professor in political science here. I've heard him speak a number of times, and of course it's always interesting and, dare I say, fascinating. He's talking on legacies of the 2008 global crisis, which is, despite the fact it's 7 years ago, how time flies when one is having fun, I guess. It is relatively recent in the history of the world, of course, and also relatively recent in how its effects are being worked out in various places around the world as well. So I'd just like to mention a couple of things about Eric before he gets up here. He's very modest, of course, so we won't mention it himself. But he was mentioned recently, very recently, maybe a month ago or so, a report came out that's based in the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it's the Teaching, Research, and International project that the university has done. And they've done a survey of international relations and political science professors in Canada. And Eric is in the top 5. So it's quite an achievement for somebody, I guess, some project that comes out of the College of William and Mary to actually focus on Waterloo, since we aren't Toronto, we aren't UBC, and we're in their eyes anyway, a fairly remote community in some distant part of Canada. So the fact that Eric is there, I think, is quite remarkable. Also, I calculated the ages of the people who are ahead of him. They're at least twice as old as he is as well. So I won't mention who's there, but they are fairly much more elderly. Some of them, in fact, have retired, and others on the list ahead of him are also retiring. So probably by this time next year or 2 years from now, Eric will be at the top of the list as opposed to number 5. So
are any of them dead?
I don't know, George. In case somebody looks at the list, I better not say one way or the other. So with that, of course, Eric is one of the most eminent Canadian political science professors we have in the country, very well known around the world. Gets invited places that other people can only dream or not about, I guess, like speaking with IMF people in Washington or other international institutions about financial issues and crises. You know, he has I don't know how long your CV is, but certainly the number of books. We probably couldn't carry all the books he's written by ourselves. We'd need some sort of help to do it. One person wouldn't be able to do that sort of thing. So American university publishers as well, very difficult to break into, but Eric has done it with impunity. So with that, we will have a question and answer period at the end. If you better have questions, because Eric, I think, will have the answers. If you don't, kudos to you on this one. But we will have a question and answer session at the end, and please feel free to speak into the mic and ask your questions. With that, George Dixon, who's the Vice President, University Research, is going to introduce Eric and speak into the mic as well. Thanks, George.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm supposed to be introducing Eric, but I think you actually did a pretty good job of that as the introductory part. First comment I would like to make, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. We tend not to spend as much time as I think we should celebrating research and scholarship at the University of Waterloo, and particularly with what I'll call our in-house community, faculty, staff, students, and alumni, that really this sort of event is targeted for, to bring people out and give them an insight as to the nature of the types of activities that we undertake. Your comment about, we're not UBC, we're not Toronto. No, we're not. We're Waterloo, and we're damn proud of it, so we'll go from there. I suppose it's fair to say that whether we like it or not, the global economy has very direct impacts on the activities that go on within universities, and universities within Canada. Universities are in some ways the luxuries of wealthy societies. I know there's a lot of dispute over whether or not that is actually true, but particularly in terms of scholarship and research, If you take a look at the costs that are associated with the research agenda and the activity of taking young people and giving them 10 years of their lives to devote specifically to scholarship before they have to go out and make a living in one way or another. Research and scholarship is arguably the activity or the luxury of a wealthy society. And with that in mind, a global economic crisis is going to very directly impact on our ability to undertake these activities, whether we like it or not. So Eric is going to talk today about what I'll call the legacy or the fallout from the 2008 crisis that came forward with really management of the economy in the world. It is a great pleasure to introduce Eric. I'm going to be slightly more formal than Bruce was, but Bruce and I do this dog and pony show quite a bit of trying to get some ideas across. Eric is a professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Waterloo. He holds a chair in international political economy, and he received his BA in economics and political science from the University of Toronto. So University of Toronto is not all bad. There's nothing wrong with that. And he did his master's and PhD in the Department of International Relations in the London School of Economics. He has authored more than a significant number of books and over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on the issues of international political economy. He is a member of the Warsaw Commission. Don't you love it when people change pages? On international financial reform and the high-level panel on the governance of Financial Stability Board. Eric has also won the Trudeau Foundation Fellowship. He has won the Donner Book Prize, the Marvin Gelber Essay Prize in International Economics, and the Simmons Award for Excellence in Teaching. Eric, the floor is yours, and please join me in welcoming him.
So thanks very much, George, for those introductions, and also to Bruce, this very kind introductory remarks, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to be given this chance to talk about my research. I essentially am thinking about talking to you for about 30 minutes about things I've been doing for 7 years, okay? So I'm going to try to summarize it very, very quickly. What I've been interested in doing for the last 7 years is I've been actively engaged in the debates about how we might reform the global financial system after the 2008 global financial crisis. And just to remind you, in some cases, Canadian audiences need this reminder more than any other because Canada was one of the few countries that was relatively insulated from the crisis. But almost every other part of the world suffered this crisis in very major ways. And in fact, the global financial crisis was the worst financial crisis that the world has experienced since the Great Depression. And in the wake of the Great Depression, there was massive reform of the way in which money and finance is organized in the world. And so when this one broke, I immediately was getting phone calls. Everyone I work with was getting phone calls. What will the reform process be this time around? And will it lead to the kind of major institution building that took place after the Great Depression? Probably the most important thing that happened after the Great Depression was a conference that took place in 1944 called the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire. And they set up the World Bank, set up the International Monetary Fund, set up the whole post-war international monetary and financial system. And that was directly, everyone who was at that conference was reflecting on what they had lived through in terms of the Great Depression. So there was lots of talk about, are we going to have a similar experience this time? So I want to talk to you about what has happened. And I want to make 3 points. The first is that what many of us, and this includes me, thought was going to happen did not. Okay, I'll explain in a second that our expectations were really quite off, and we had very grand expectations initially, and those expectations were dashed, in fact, fairly quickly. The second thing is to argue that although we then began to think, oh my gosh, this is very different than the experience after the Great Depression, where not much is changing. We are beginning, and I think we're living through the process right now, of seeing some incremental changes which may lead to larger things over time. And I'll explain what those things are in a second. And then the third point I want to make, and I'll just finish up very quickly with this at the end, is to talk about what the world that we may be moving into is going to look like. And I'm going to argue for you, it looks like a very uncertain world. And in fact, I'm quite worried about some of the incremental changes that we're seeing in terms of their potential long-term impact. So that's essentially what I'll try to do. I'm going to be drawing on, just in case you're interested in hearing about these issues in much greater depth, I'm going to be drawing on 3 books which I published last year. The first one was really about the first argument, which is to say we thought this crisis was going to be transformative in terms of what it did for the way in which money and finance is organized globally. And I published this book last year saying actually it was quite the opposite. It was basically a status quo crisis, where you have a massive shock to the world financial system and almost nothing changes. It's really an extraordinary development. And for a political scientist like me, it's very interesting to try to explain how can that happen. We're used to explaining change. We're not so used to explaining when things don't change. But that's the situation, as I'll explain in a second. The second book was an edited collection where we brought together some of the world's leading specialists who deal with China's approach to the world monetary and financial system. And as I'll explain in a second, the incremental changes that we're seeing, that I think we're living through right now, are almost all being driven by China. And so it's absolutely central to understand what China thinks about the world monetary and financial system. And so that's what that second book did. And it's actually the very first book ever published, trying to analyze the way the Chinese government thinks about international monetary and financial issues, because it really didn't matter very much until the last decade. The third is a book which I published and actually took me a very long time. It took about 12 years of research trying to understand what happened last time. So in the wake of the Great Depression, leading up to this famous conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, I went through many, many archives trying to understand exactly what were the politics that generated such a major change last time, and can we learn anything from those for this period. So that's the more detailed look. Okay, let me just try to remind you of what the expectations were, because we're in a situation where these expectations were not borne out. But it's important to remember what they were and how high they were in the 2008 period. So there was a lot of talk, and I was involved in this, about how this was a kind of Bretton Woods moment. We're experiencing the worst global financial crisis since the Depression. Maybe it's a chance to do what they did in 1944, which is to rebuild the system in a major way. And this is the famous hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where 44 different governments met and set up the IMF, set up the World Bank, these major institutions that we still live with today. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, but it's a beautiful place. And this hotel, I went to see that movie, the Grand Budapest, is the Grand Budapest Hotel? I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's very similar. It's sort of a beautiful but kind of cavernous hotel in which very few people stay, but absolutely spectacular setting to hold a conference. And they held it there in 1944 explicitly to try to get some of the world's leading thinkers away from the media, away from, I mean, there were some media invited, but away from the kind of policy-making community that might interfere with a grand design. And they created the grand design in 1944. So when this crisis took place, there were many politicians who were saying, can we recreate that? So let me just give you a quote. That's a picture of Sarkozy, the French president at the time, who said in September 2008, so that's right around the time that AIG is collapsing and that we've got the Lehman Brothers collapse. He said, we have to redesign the entire financial and monetary system, as was done in Bretton Woods. So here's then 1 month later, Gordon Brown, who's the British Prime Minister at the time. It's very similar. He says, what we need is a very large, very radical changes that would be a new Bretton Woods. And then Joe Stiglitz was very active in this debate, Nobel Prize-winning economist. Stiglitz was also talking a lot at this time about this is a Bretton Woods moment. We have to seize it and do very ambitious things. So if you were a scholar like me, you thought this is very exciting. And we began to think about what are the things that they may, in fact, want to change. And there were many expectations. I don't have time to talk about them all, but I want to talk about 2 in particular, which were derived from a sense that this crisis was really a crisis centered in the United States, and it was a crisis that symbolized a decline of American power in the system. And so the expectations were a lot about that development. So for example, one of the leading expectations was that the US dollar, which has been the foundation of the international monetary and financial system since the Bretton Woods Conference. This is a picture from the Bretton Woods meetings. And it was at those meetings where they enshrined the idea that the dollar would be the world's currency. That in fact may be coming to an end. That one of the major changes that may result from 2008 would be some diminution of the US dollar's central position. that was one expectation. A second one was that the US had essentially lost its ability to be the main crisis manager of the system. So we've had many smaller crises in the post-war period, and in every case, it's been US authorities that have been the center of managing those crises. So you can think about the Latin American debt crisis in the early 1980s, the East Asian crisis in the late 1990s. Each of those crises, the US is managing the system. And yet here we are in 2008, the crisis is centered in its own markets, and it looked like it had lost its capacity to, in fact, play that role of crisis manager. And so you had, in November of 2008, which is right around the time that these people are making these statements about a new Bretton Woods, you had the creation, for the first time, of the G20 Leaders Forum, where the leaders of the most important 20 largest economies in the world came together, and they held their first conference to discuss how are we going to manage the crisis. And to many people looking at that, this was a symbol that the US had to reach out. You know, this is a crisis they could not manage themselves anymore, and they had to reach out. By the way, it's important to remember that that conference was called by George W. Bush. And you know, I think it's fair to say Bush was not known as a strong multilateral thinker. And Bush, you know, in fact, did a major institutional reform in bringing the G20 into existence. And it was, in fact, one of the very last things he did as president. And again, people perceive that as if even Bush wants this, it must be the US is really in trouble and needs other people's help. Okay, let me go through those two expectations and show for you how neither one of them ended up mattering very much. And the expectations that we had about the decline in the US global role and that the G20 would be this major new crisis manager, neither one of those, I think, was borne out. And it's very, very striking that people could get their expectations so off. US dollar is particularly striking in this respect, where you had a lot of expectations. In fact, I should mention, you had expectations even before the financial crisis began. Some of you might remember back in 2005, 2006, even in 2007, if you read The Economist on a regular basis or even read any financial press, the US dollar had been declining in value since about 2002. And it had larger and larger trade deficits, larger and larger budget problems, external debt problems. And there was a lot of talk, even before the crisis happened, that the US dollar was about to face a serious crisis, a loss of confidence. And I remember attending conferences in 2006, 2007, where people said, all it needs is a spark. You know, if there's some kind of financial crisis somewhere, this will really be the trigger for a collapse of confidence. And then we had this crisis, which is centered in the United States. And so very quickly, as the crisis began to break out, which was in about fall of 2007, you had leading journalists. So here's a quote from The Economist saying, you know, there's a new fear that now stalks the markets, that the dollar slide could spin out of control. You had leading institutional investors making this prediction. George Soros, probably the most famous investor in the world, wrote a whole book in 2008 saying this is the end of the era of the US dollar as a global currency. You had even top US policymakers. So the Treasury Secretary at that time, George Bush's Treasury Secretary, was a fellow called Hank Paulson. And he wrote a memoir after the crisis where he said, I was terrified throughout 2008 about what was going to happen to the US dollar. So very widespread expectations of some kind of crisis. These are reinforced by the sense that for the very first time in the post-war period, there was a serious alternative to the US dollar, and that was considered to be the euro, which had been created at the turn of the century and was backed and managed by an extremely conservative central bank whose mandate was price stability. So if you're an investor, it looked like something that you might want to invest in a currency managed by that kind of institution. Now, what happens? Well, the strange thing that happens is as the crisis intensified, so as you get into August, September of 2008, instead of collapsing, the dollar actually went up in value. And in fact, its appreciation was larger than any time since the early 1970s. So exactly the opposite of what everyone was expecting. And this was a surprise not just to investors, to many academics, but even to policymakers who are at the center of the system. Let me just read you a quote from the head of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, who I should say how we get these quotes. Every 5 years, there's a central decision-making body in the US Central Bank which has to release transcripts of its meetings. And these are fairly unedited. They're very kind of verbatim what people were saying. It's a bit like reading WikiLeaks. And we have the transcripts now from this moment, 2008. So this is Ben Bernanke telling his colleagues around the meeting table in about late October. He says, somewhat ironically, all this deterioration in the global outlook has led the dollar to appreciate very sharply, which is interesting to say the least. Okay? So this is the lead central banker in the world is even surprised by the development, having trouble understanding what it's all about. Now it's important to understand the broader significance of that. If we had had the opposite, if there really had been a dollar crisis, this would have been very serious for the United States. It had many problems already, but if you had compounded it with a dollar crisis, the situation would have been much worse. Probably the US Federal Reserve would have had to raise interest rates to try to restore some stability in the US crisis, and think about the extent to which there were adjustable rate mortgages all across the US that would have been triggered by any raise in the interest rate. The Fed is trying to push them down at that time. For the world as a whole, if there'd been a dollar crisis, commodity prices probably would have gone haywire. It would have changed the financing patterns in ways that would have been very, very disruptive. The fact that we did not have a dollar crisis was an absolutely central kind of non-event, if you like, in the crisis, which meant that it was much better, if you can say that, than it might have been otherwise. And so the key question is why? Especially because people did not anticipate this. It's important to note that the people who are plowing into the dollar in this period were both private investors, but also official holders of the dollar. And the dollar has very, very large foreign official holders. So I'm sure you're aware of some of the countries, the most important of which is China, holds today almost $4 trillion worth in reserves, and mostly held in US dollars. But there are many other countries too across East Asia. Russia holds used to hold large dollar reserves until its latest problems. And Japan and many countries in the Gulf region as well hold very large dollar holdings. Both the private markets and those governments were plowing in. They were giving support to the US at the height of this crisis. And so we have to ask why. And I think the clearest answer is that we got a very clear demonstration. For a social scientist like me, this was a wonderful experimental situation where we saw very clearly the kind of structural power that the United States has in the world economy, which we teach about and we write about, but we don't see demonstrated in such a stark way very often. So let me just give you some of the examples of what this power is based on. The US has the largest, most liquid, and deepest financial markets in the world. In particular, the market for US government debt, the US Treasury market, is the largest financial market for investors in the world. And when markets began to go haywire, everyone plowed into that market because it was one of the very few financial markets in the world that continued to function relatively smoothly because of its depth and liquidity. And so it's such an ironic situation where you have the crisis center of the United States, and yet it has the market that everybody wants to flee to for kind of safe haven reasons. And the contrast here needs to be drawn with the euro. If you were an investor in September 2008, and you are China, you have a trillion, at that point, at the beginning of the crisis, they had about $1.5 trillion in reserves, and you're thinking, where do I park those reserves in a moment of instability? And you look to the euro, you're going to have to hold it in some kind of European government debt. But there is no European government at the whole. And so you have to hold it in some national one. And the largest place that you can hold euro-denominated debt is Italy. Okay? So it's really a choice that the Chinese had to buy Italian government debt or to buy US treasuries. And most people would find that a relatively easy choice. You might think, what about German government debt? There is a German government debt market, but it's very small. I'll just give you the numbers. At that time, the US Treasury market was over $7 trillion. The German one was about 1.4. And it's not a very liquid market. It's held by long-term institutional investors. They don't trade. It's not highly liquid. So this was sort of a demonstration of the extent to which US Treasuries are at the center, the kind of fulcrum of the world financial system. Let me just read you a quote, which was from a Chinese official in early 2009 who was asked by people, why are you continuing to support the US Treasury market in the moment that they're having such a crisis? And this is what he said. Except for US Treasuries, what else can you hold? US Treasuries are a safe haven for everyone, including China. It is the only option. Once you start issuing, and he's talking to Americans, once you start issuing 1 trillion, 2 trillion, we know the dollar is going to depreciate, so we hate you guys, but there's nothing much we can do. Okay? That's the kind of structural power that the United States has as a result of the financial markets being at the center of the system. The second key thing is that so many countries around the world rely on the United States as a market for their exports. And in particular, this is true for the Chinese. And so as the crisis began to intensify, people wanted to secure their market access into the US market. And part of that is making sure that your exchange rate is staying low. But in order to keep the Chinese exchange rate low, they have to buy dollars to try to accumulate them. And that had the effect of supporting the dollar, ironically, in a way that is not anticipated, but it is the effect. There's some arguments made, and I don't think we'll know probably for years until archives open, but some people argue that people who are very close allies of the United States, Japan and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, very large dollar holders, probably didn't want to dump dollars because of the larger security relationship. But we have no proof, we're just guessing there. We do know that foreign governments think about their dollar holdings in geostrategic terms. So I'll give you the most dramatic example during the crisis. Hank Paulson, in his memoirs, tells a fascinating story about the summer of 2008, where he's attending the Beijing Olympics. And at the Beijing Olympics, he's told by his intelligence officials that the Russian government has been meeting with Chinese officials to try to convince China and Russia to deliberately dump dollars as a way of putting pressure on US policymakers. So you can see people think about the dollar holdings in a way that's very strategic. And Hank Paulson says the Chinese didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't want to cause that kind of trouble. But the Russian government was more interested in generating instability. The final thing is that there are some governments in China, again, is the leading example, who have accumulated so many dollars already that to see the value of the dollar decline is actually against their interests. And so they're kind of in what people have called a Drawler trap. You have the investments, you need the investments to maintain their value, and so in fact you're vested in supporting them. Now here's the two people who are managing all this stuff throughout 2008 before Barack Obama is elected. It's George Bush, and that's a picture of Hank Paulson. If you read accounts of the crisis, you can see that they were constantly phoning up people, trying to convince the dollars to come in. And so it's possible to say there was also a lot of US diplomacy involved in this. But I think at the core of it is a story about structural power. Even if they hadn't been making those phone calls, the support would have been there for the US. So by the end of the crisis, and even coming up to the current day, we have a situation where the US dollar's global role is virtually unchanged from where it was in 2007. In fact, I was looking at this last night. The latest report from the International Monetary Fund says the following: the status of the US dollar as a reserve currency seems, if anything, more secure now than it was in 2006. Okay? Exactly the opposite of what everybody anticipated at the start of this crisis. Okay, now, having said that, I mentioned at the beginning that my second argument is to say the expectations were not realized, but we are seeing now incremental changes coming out of the crisis as kind of longer-term legacies. And here the central development is coming from China. This is a picture of the People's Bank of China. What we're seeing coming out of China since 2008 is a growing frustration with the dependence that they have on the US dollar's global role. And we saw it a little bit before the crisis, but we see it much more. And as I mentioned, I published this book, and we brought together many specialists, enormous evidence to show the degree of frustration among Chinese policy community in the dollar's global role. What is that frustration coming from? You can guess the reasons. They watch that experience and they say, this is really a kind of exorbitant privilege the United States has. It has a crisis and everyone comes to help it. Is this fair? There's some concerns the Chinese have about their own self-interest, the dependence they have on a currency that doesn't seem, from their standpoint, to be very well managed. I think the trigger point here was, you may remember, in the summer of 2011, where US Congress was in a stalemate over the budget and came within an inch's distance of defaulting on US government debt, something never happened in the post-war period. And the Chinese, who hold trillions of dollars worth of US government debt, were faced with a situation of the US government defaulting on them. And so that kind of what they perceive as irresponsibility has led to a desire for them to insulate themselves from the dependence that they have on the United States. And I think that's also true for the current president of China, Xi Jinping. a sense in which having a world currency is a source of power more generally, source of prestige in the world, and he thinks that China as a rising power needs to be sharing in that prestige in a way that the US has been monopolizing. So what have we seen? Well, the most dramatic statement that we saw came from the head of the People's Bank of China, Governor Zhou, who released a paper in March of 2009 essentially criticizing the US dollar's global role without ever using the word US dollar. But everybody knew what it was about, and it made headlines across all the financial press because it was the most assertive position the Chinese had ever taken in sort of directly confronting US monetary power. Since then, the Chinese government has been promoting the internationalization of its own currency, the renminbi, in very incremental steps. And so they'll do, and maybe I should say, first of all, that for a country whose economy is as important as it is in the world, China's, it's remarkable how little the renminbi is used internationally. And that's because the Chinese financial system is incredibly controlled compared to most other financial systems. So if you want to use renminbi or if you want to invest in China, you're subject to all kinds of controls at the border, but you're also subject to controls even if you get through the border inside the country in terms of how finance is managed. And so investors and people who are involved in the international business community have had no interest in participating in renminbi business because of the constraints that are imposed on their behavior. And so what China's been doing is gradually liberalizing those things. And it's sort of step by step, saying to merchants, you can now trade in renminbi on your own. We won't control that kind of thing as much as we did in the past. Then they have all kinds of diplomatic initiatives, of which Canada has been a recent recipient of one, where they have a deal with a foreign central bank and they say, we offer you a loan which can cover problems you might have in renminbi trade if in return you set up some kind of a clearing network that allows renminbi to be cleared, in the Canadian case in Toronto. And so we just set one up last week, and many other countries are doing this at the moment. Sort of gradual, incremental steps to promote their renminbi. What this looks like for someone like me who has studied the history of the international monetary system is that we're moving away from the dollar-centered world to a much more multipolar currency system. But it's extremely slow and it's extremely incremental. Let me just highlight for you some of the limitations in what China is doing. This is a picture of Shanghai. Nobody in the world financial system thinks of Shanghai as a major world financial center. It's too cut off by all kinds of controls that the Chinese government has in place. It has capital controls so that you can't move money in and out of the country freely. Its own financial markets in Shanghai and other places in China are extremely underdeveloped. So if you want to participate in something like the US Treasury bill market, there's no real equivalent. And then there's deeper issues about the way in which contracts are maintained, and I think even deeper issues of trust. You know, one of the reasons why people hold US Treasuries is a sense in which this kind of pro-creditor property rights are defended, and this is a long-standing tradition, and people wonder, you know, if you held Chinese assets, will there be the same kind of protection? And so in this book that we've published, we try to go through, you know, why is the Chinese government so slow and incremental? And there's a very clear story about this, which is the Chinese government's control of the financial system is part of its broader development model. That China has been very successful in industrializing very rapidly by exports to the world, but it does it by a very state-controlled financial system. And so essentially, China is faced with a choice. If they want to acquire world monetary power, they have to give up the power that they have domestically over their financial system. And that means giving up control over the banks and over corporations and all kinds of things that are both central to how it's generated rapid economic growth, but even central to the control of the Communist Party and its rule within China. So it's a very, very difficult situation, and that's, I think, why we're seeing the slow incrementalism surrounding it. Okay, that's the first story. Let me just tell you the second story very quickly. Second expectation was that the US was basically unable to manage the crisis in 2008, and so had to appeal to all these other countries to establish the G20 Leaders Forum as a kind of crisis manager. And two things are said to have happened that the G20 was asked to do. One was to coordinate national stimulus programs. And so if you remember back to 2008, the Harper government and many other governments around the world had kind of stimulus programs in 2008 into 2009. And the big question, analytical question for people like me is, was the G20 organizing that? And some people have made the claim. I think it's a very unconvincing claim. I think most governments were doing it on their own. They're faced with the economic crisis, you spend more, and you kind of get out of it. And so I think the case that the G20 played that role is not very convincing. But the more interesting debates have been about the G20's role in launching what was called, in April 2009, a $1.1 trillion rescue plan. And this is a plan that still to this day, someone like Gordon Brown, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, says that rescue plan essentially saved the world economy. There was a summit meeting of G20 leaders. They agreed on a massive plan. I'll explain its details in a second. And there was a turnaround in the world economy at that time. And so many people have associated the G20 as the success. The US used to do these things. Now the G20 did it collectively. Well, it's interesting to look at what exactly the G20 did. Because the rescue plan, at the core of it, was to give a very large sum of money to the International Monetary Fund, which is that body that had been created at Bretton Woods in 1944. And to say to the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, you lend money to any country that's in distress, essentially in the crisis. And they certainly got that money. But what's very striking when you look at the numbers is that the IMF ended up lending to almost nobody until the European crisis began later on. At the height of the crisis, there's very few IMF loans going out. And it's an interesting question about why people did not want to borrow from the IMF. There were lots of countries that needed money. So Korea, for example, is having severe financial problems. They need a loan, and yet the Korean finance minister stands up and says, for sentimental reasons, my country will never take an IMF loan. Or Singapore looks as though they're needing all kinds of problems. And it's very clear, Singapore politicians say, there's no way we're going to an IMF loan. And if you look at the reasons why, it's a kind of a stigma going back about a decade that the IMF had been living with, where it had done a lot of loans in the East Asian crisis in 1997, 98, and was perceived to have made a lot of mistakes. The IMF was too tough, too much austerity. They called for certain kinds of policies that were perceived now to have been mistakes. And so if you're living in Korea, you lived through that period, you're never going back to that institution. That was the kind of sentiment. And then there were broader complaints that many potential borrowers had with the way the IMF is governed. It's an American-controlled institution. It has not adjusted its voting shares very well to accommodate the rising powers of China and India and Brazil, et cetera. And so the IMF, although it gets all this money from the G20, is actually standing there with almost no customers. So it's very striking that G20 in that sense doesn't do very much. The body that did the most in kind of being the crisis manager, interestingly, was the United States Federal Reserve. In other words, exactly what has always happened historically. The US was the crisis manager, even though it was at the center of what happened. What did the Federal Reserve do? These things were not well publicized in the media, but they were much more important than what the G20 was doing. The Federal Reserve, even before the very first G20 meeting ever happened, was lending massive amounts of money to 14 of the most important central banks around the world. That included Korea, included Brazil, included Singapore. And these governments were given very, very large sums. They were called swap lines. And if you want the size of the swap lines, at one point, almost $600 billion worth. The largest the IMF ever lent out at the height was about 167 in 2008, 2009. So the Federal Reserve is so much more important in terms of what's going on at this time. The Federal Reserve is even allowing foreign financial institutions to borrow directly from its own facilities that are set up during the crisis to lend to people. Where's the G20? The G20 has nothing to do with this activity. And I can't highlight that more. That we thought the G20 was going to be this big, important institution, and yet it's completely marginalized from where the real action is going on. The real action is the US Federal Reserve. At one point, the Korean government even says, can we please move all this Federal Reserve activity to the G20? So there's kind of a G20 agreement that we all will be able to borrow from swap lines collectively. And the US says, we don't want to do that. We don't want to get into a commitment where we're lending to so many different countries. And in fact, we know some G20 countries asked the US for support in the crisis, and the Federal Reserve wouldn't give it to them. So for example, South Africa, India, Indonesia were declared not worthy of Fed swaps. So they were very selective in who they were giving the money to. So what's the point here? The point is this is a status quo outcome. The crisis was managed by the United States just as past crises have been done. Okay, now as is the case with the issue of the US dollar, where it's status quo, but then there's incremental changes coming out as people react to what they saw. The same is true in this situation, where we have a status quo outcome, the US manages the crisis, but people have reacted to the way in which that happened in a way that we're now seeing incremental changes that will cause a transformation over the longer term. And at the center of it is the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the BRICS countries are showing a kind of growing frustration with a set of US decisions that have been taking place since the crisis. Let me just mention two in particular. One is that the Federal Reserve has said very clearly that it will not promise to lend swap lines to very many countries if there's another crisis breaking out next year. And in fact, they listed the countries that they're willing to have a permanent arrangement with, and they're the Central Bank of Switzerland, Canada, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Bank of Japan. Nobody else. So if you're Brazil, or if you're South Africa, or if you're India, and you think, I may be about to face a crisis, the Federal Reserve is making no promise to you, and they're very, very explicit about that. In fact, we had a statement recently from top US Fed official who said, we're not the world's central bank. Really trying to make clear that's not part of their mandate. And so if you're in those countries, you're wanting to do something about that. The second key thing which has caused a lot of frustration is the fact that there has been an effort to reform the governance of the IMF, to try to give more voting shares to all of these countries. And the Obama administration has supported it, but the US Congress is refusing to pass it. And we're now at 5 years since these reforms were agreed to in 2010. Over and over again, Congress is refusing to pass this. And so if you're in these countries and you're saying, who's the crisis manager going to be? The Fed's saying it's not necessarily us. You think, well, maybe I'll get some money from the IMF. But the IMF is still that American-controlled institution that we're frustrated with. So you have lots of reasons to do something. What are they doing? I don't have time to explain the details. But what the BRICS countries are trying to do is establish their own swaps amongst each other. And some of these are driven by China alone, saying bilaterally, I will promise Argentina a certain amount of money in the event that there's a crisis. I promise one to Brazil. I promise to South Africa. And then collectively, they're doing this through a body called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which really is a mini IMF that they're creating on their own, saying we can't trust the IMF anymore. We can't trust the United States. We have to have our own security net. And there's a similar one in Asia called the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization. Okay. What does this look like? It looks like very similar to in the currency realm, where we're seeing a more decentralized order coming into being incrementally. We're seeing the same in this area. Crisis management, when we hit the next crisis, is probably going to be managed in a much more decentralized way. It won't be the Fed. It'll be all these different new institutions that are being created. We don't know how effective they're going to be. The limitations are that they're untested. And we also don't know if they have enough money. Some of these institutions are relatively small in what they're establishing for the needs that may arise in a crisis. So where are we going? Just to quickly sum up, and I want to make the last point very quickly. What have we seen? Expectations weren't met. This was not a Bretton Woods moment. The things that people thought would be majorly transformed in 2008 are status quo. That was the witness of the crisis. What we saw is an enduring sort of US centrality in a way that nobody quite expected, given the crisis had started in the United States itself. But, and this is my second point, we are seeing these kind of gradual incremental changes as people react to what they experienced since the 2008 crisis. The internationalization of the RMB and this kind of institution building by BRICS countries in very slow incremental ways. And so if we're thinking about longer term legacies, they're not what we thought, but there are some quite important legacies. I think we're heading to a much more decentralized order. We're not quite there yet. Like the RMB is not a major world currency yet, but that's clearly the trend. And it's taking place not in a kind of Bretton Woods way, giant conference, not a big bang. It's incremental, slow experimentation essentially going on. Okay, let me finish up with the third and final point, which is what does all this mean for the average citizen if we're moving into a more decentralized order? I'm worried about it. I'll tell you why I'm worried about it. A decentralized currency order, historically, when we've had two currencies kind of competing for world monetary dominance, it's tended to generate quite a bit of volatility. And people are even talking already about currency wars and kind of rivalry that can sometimes exist in a context like that. In the crisis management situation, will this generate more instability? If you don't really know who or where the buck stops in a crisis, is that risky in terms of expectations? If any of you are investors, you know that financial markets are driven by expectations. If the expectation is not clear, who is the crisis manager? We're not exactly sure. That's potentially quite a problem. And then there's a deeper question of whether this decentralization takes place in a cooperative way, which is my hope, that as the RMB rises, there's cooperative relationships between the RMB and the dollar, or that the BRICS institutions cooperate with the IMF, or if these things are increasingly in a kind of rivalry situation, generating conflict between the two. And I can give you evidence on both sides. Very last thing I want to say is that I think we have a big test case coming. So if you are wondering, what that world may look like, all you need to watch is the news in the next 12 months or so, where we all know that the US Federal Reserve is saying it's going to start raising its interest rates. And across the world, people are watching this very carefully because there's enormous accumulation of debts in different parts of the world because interest rates have been so low since the crisis. And we know that as Federal Reserve rates go up, there will be crises triggered. We're just not quite sure exactly where they're going to be. But I'll give you some examples. There are many places in the emerging market countries, Latin America, for example, and across much of East Asia, that have enormous dollar-denominated debt in the corporate sector, not in the official sector, but in the corporate sector. And as interest rates go up, it's also happening that the US dollar is going up, and the debt load that those corporations are experiencing is rising. And so if you read the reports of the key financial regulators, they're very worried about what may happen. So we get a trigger. Who's going to manage that? That's going to be the test case. We're just not quite sure at this point. So I'll finish there with a depressing note, but I hope that's interesting to have a bit of an overview. But
Okay, thanks very much, Eric. It's a stimulating talk for sure. And happily, I have no investment, so I don't have to worry. But questions or comments, or remember, speak into the mic.
Fantastic talk. Thank you very much for doing it. Your quote about the Chinese government during the crisis, it said that it didn't have any option. It was
Yes.
only option to invest in America.
Yes.
What about gold and the kind of taking a step back from fiat currencies?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, from the Chinese standpoint, so they now have close to $4 trillion in reserves. You can't plow all that into gold. But you're right to say that at the moment they are looking for alternatives, in many of which are more real economy things rather than financial assets. So one of the things the Chinese government has been doing in the last year or two is trying to shift much of its assets into investments in Latin America, for example, or in Africa, or much of East Asia. And it's often commodity extraction, but it is real activity. It's not just holding a financial asset in U.S. Treasury bills. And that's I think that's explicitly driven by that sense that they're getting poor returns, it's unstable returns, and it's, you're very dependent on a country which is not necessarily an ally, in all issues for you. And so you're trying to find other. So many of you will know if you're from Latin America or if you've traveled in Latin America, I mean, the Chinese presence in Latin America now is very, very large, especially in countries that are exporting resources, and that's a very new phenomenon, and it's linked to trying to take those surpluses and redirect them in another place. I think that's the more likely than following into gold.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you see on the horizon a sort of maybe a delay in a Bretton Woods moment, if that moment's not coming.
Yes.
I look at as a layperson, I see spending or printing of dollars and other currencies and competitive devaluations and negative interest rates in Denmark and Sweden where you pay the bank to take the money and they pay you to take a mortgage. At what point do these central banks actually have the capacity to manage all this? And if you layer on top of that derivatization instruments, off balance sheet, debts and liabilities, is there not a big accident waiting to happen that will sort of very near term possibly create a Bretton Woods moment?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I don't know if everyone could hear that. Could you hear over here? Yeah, okay. So I think I share your pessimism. I mean, I think there's enormous accumulation of risky situations. And you highlighted some of the same ones that I would highlight. I am very worried about the derivatives markets, which were supposed to be regulated tightly after the crisis, and the G20 led an initiative. And some things have been done, but there's enormous amounts still to be done. And we may hit a crisis next year, and they're not well regulated. They've been trying to push derivatives activity, which is one of the largest markets in the world, through central clearinghouses, but we don't even know how safe the clearinghouses themselves are. So that may be where the next crisis happens. So I agree with your pessimism. I don't know, I'm not so sure about the second part of what you're hoping for, I think, which is, let's say we have a crisis and it's very, very severe. Would that then generate the Bretton Woods moment? It might, but it might be a very chaotic situation as well. I mean, the political conditions, I mentioned I've finished this book on the origins of the Bretton Woods meeting. The political conditions for that were extremely unique. This is 1944. The war is still on, and so all the countries that attend there are allies in a war. D-Day, in fact, is just happening as the Bretton Woods Conference begins. So it's very specific situation. U.S. leadership is known to be unparalleled at that time. So everyone's sort of looking to a single leader. And I think it'd also be fair to say there was a high degree of intellectual consensus about what needed to be done. None of those things exist today. We're in a situation where the major powers that would need to come together are not allies necessarily. You don't have an intellectual consensus at all. We don't have a kind of Keynesian sort of situation as we did at Bretton Woods. You don't have the U.S. leadership. It's there, but it's not nearly as strong as it used to be. And in fact, I think the most striking development in the last few years is the extent to which the U.S. is turning inward. So Congress should be approving this reform, which actually doesn't affect American interests much. It's really about reducing the European vote and giving more to China that way. But they're so resistant to it. The fact that Congress almost defaulted on U.S. government debt, I mean, that to me is an extreme insularity, given how important that is to the U.S. position in the world. And so I'm not optimistic about the role of the U.S. government and its capacity to lead at this point. Even if they're very clever officials who know what needs to be done, they can't mobilize it politically within the U.S. system at the moment. So that's my pessimism.
Just picking up a bit on that comment, as they say, capital seeks returns. And if the interest rates do start coming up, I was just wondering, even in terms of your big data comments, you've mentioned about the trillions of dollars of T-bills held by the Chinese.
Yeah.
When you pull back even more than 100 years ago, when a financier such as J.P. Morgan could literally have bankrolled U.S. debt.
Yeah.
And then you see as well sort of these machinations of the supreme wealthy, uber rich pulling together almost kind of elite circles to figure out what they might do to help the situation. Can you just comment about even the ratio of bank assets to GDP and how the banks themselves as individual corporations are having a role in all of this?
Yeah, those are very interesting points. I think underlying your question was what some people call the financialization of major economies. So since the 1980s in particular, there has been the proportion that finance takes out of the whole GNP has been rising, in some cases very dramatically. And so the financial sector has become bloated. And you have top regulators, one famous British regulator who said, this is not socially optimal at this point, the size that finance has within national economies. And historically, when that's happened, because we've seen cycles of financialization in the past, it's usually been at the end of a growth boom. And so we had the post-war growth boom. It then slowed down in the 1970s, and you had financialization kind of as a way of coping with that. And so some people interpret what we've been living through for the last 2 or 3 decades in a similar way. But it usually comes to an end. And so the 2008 crisis actually looked like that end, but it wasn't. It's managed through these various ways I've been describing. And so the financialization trends are still ongoing, even though many of us thought that might at least come to an end. So that's been another kind of status quo outcome, in a way, of that crisis. I think your other point is a very interesting one about the capacity of private groups, very wealthy private groups, to manage instability. And you're right that historically, we didn't used to have central banks. It used to be the J.P. Morgans and the Rothschilds and all these very powerful private groups that would do the managing when crises happen. I think it's very difficult in the current context for a private group to do that. The size of the flows are so large that you need a public authority. And the public authority needs, an unlimited capacity to print the thing that people need. And at the moment, that's US dollars. So the reason the Federal Reserve is at the center of all this is they're the only authority in the world that can print unlimited amounts of US dollars, which is what everybody needed when things were in crisis. And no private body has that capacity, So that's, I think, the shift that we've gone through with the rise of central banks and all those things in the 20th century. So.
Hi, Eric. A couple of sort of observations, and I'm hoping that I'm drawing the wrong conclusion because I don't want to be a fly in the ointment. I think when you sort of finished the lectures and your slide on choppy waters, right, there were a couple of observations that you made, and if I remember them correctly, you seem to be worried a little bit about decentralized currency markets, that's what you call it, being volatile. I think you were referring to a decentralized reserve currency markets. That's where the emphasis should have been. Second was decentralized decision making at the global level, where you were, I guess, referring that probably it was in the end all right if the Federal Reserve Bank of the US stepped in to solve the crisis rather than depend upon the G20. But yet, when you started the lecture, you actually seemed surprised. You said, like everybody else, that G20 didn't seem to play the role that it apparently played in some people's understanding. Now, if you are surprised there, I would have thought that you meant a sigh of relief, because in the end, you're concluding that you're glad that it didn't happen.
Yes.
So could you explain that?
Yes.
Or maybe you want to make extra comments on that.
Oh, those are great comments. So I'm particularly grateful on the first one because it allows me to clarify. I'm thinking about reserve competition. So the last time we had a kind of a transition of leadership, we had a transition from British sterling being the dominant currency in the 1920s, 30s, to the US dollar. And it was a period of instability. And especially central banks, which one do you hold? Do you shift it around? And that's the kind of thing I'm worried about. On the second question, I agree with you. It's a very interesting situation. So I was someone who was very supportive of the creation of the G20. And I was very involved in fact, I attended in the media room the first G20 summit. And it was a very exciting moment. We'd been waiting for this, and it looked like a cooperative outcome. And so in that sense, I'm not critical of the G20. But I think people have overstated what it did. And so Gordon Brown and many scholars included say, the G20 really saved the world in the crisis. And I just think that's a misinterpretation. I think it was the Fed that really was at the center. But now, as you say, that we're moving into a situation where the Fed may not play that role, that's where someone like me does hope that the G20 rises to that occasion and tries to coordinate the BRICS arrangements and the IMF and in some kind of way that is more cooperative. And in a way that is a role the G20 is beautifully designed for if it can play that role well. But I would say I wouldn't want to predict it yet. I'm not quite sure. I don't know if that helps to clarify. Yeah.
In the years following the crisis, Canada was kind of walking tall for a little while, by the impression that was given that we didn't have as big problems as some others. Do you think that was just dumb luck, or were you doing something actually really right at the time? And then just secondly, if you would be interested to comment, I guess the federal government is having a very difficult time right now deciding whether or not to participate in the Asian Development Bank. And if you have some thoughts on that, I'd be interested in the context of what you were discussing.
Sure. Maybe the second one first. I personally am astonished at the position the US government has taken on the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. So for those of you who aren't familiar, one of the things that BRICS are doing is not just creating these kind of mini IMFs, but almost a mini World Bank which is meant to provide long-term development finance. And so in the last couple of months, China proposed this bank, which it would be in control of, there's no doubt about that, but then invited many other countries to join. And the United States had a very active campaign to try to convince its allies not to join this Chinese bank, Chinese-centered bank, and has lost that battle, essentially. The British have now agreed to join, the Italians, the Germans, and so the US looks very isolated, a country that won't approve reforms of the World Bank and the or IMF in particular, government structure, but also won't allow someone else to create a new one. It just looks really terrible, I think, in a diplomatic sense. And so I think it would have been much better for the US and all the Western allies to immediately say, this is great that China wants to contribute. They're contributing most of the money, so we understand why they want to have most of the control, but it's a good initiative that China is taking a multilateral approach to what it's doing, rather than bilateral lending, which it's done a lot of in the last few years. So I'm very supportive of people who say we should be encouraging China when it takes multilateral initiatives to be saying those are good initiatives. And the first question is a very controversial question still to this day. So the question of why did Canada emerge relatively unscathed from the crisis? I'll give you the leading theories. So some theories are that because we're commodity export and commodity prices went up as the crisis got worse, that we benefited. So Australia also benefited from that. We benefit. Much of Latin America had a relatively good experience in certain commodities. And then there's a set of theories about, was there something distinctive about the Canadian banking system, Canadian financial system, which led it to be more stable? I think some of those arguments are more convincing than others. I think the most convincing in my mind is some regulatory things we had in place were very good. We had leverage ratios, for example. And we also, I think it'd be fair to say the Canadian banking system is a somewhat cozy cartel, which many people are critical of in normal times, but it also led to less competitive pressures to do crazy, risky things that the American banking system was involved in. And so there are different moments where you can see some of the big Canadian banks contemplating, getting into some of that stuff, and then thinking, oh, but we have a good deposit base, do we really need to be doing that? And that, in the sense, was a benefit to us in the end. Some people have made kind of cultural arguments that the Canadian banking system was more, bankers were more clever in some way. I'm more skeptical of those. I'll give you the big counter case is that in the late 1980s, some of you will remember that some of the leading Canadian banks wanted to get involved in mergers and getting into the US system. And they wanted to buy many of the same institutions that got into enormous trouble in 2008. And Paul Martin at that time said no. In fact, Jean Chrétien in particular was very strong that if there was bank mergers in Canada, would shut down the branches in Shawinigan, and that was a crucially important decision in retrospect because it kept the Canadian banking system more national. They didn't get involved in the US system as much as they might have, but it was a decision made not necessarily anticipating all this stuff coming, but in retrospect, a great decision. So, but Canadian bankers wanted to get involved, and they were told they couldn't. So they're not always so clever in that sense.
Thanks. Actually, we're out of time, and I think we just have the room until 1. I'm very sorry, but anybody who has any questions of Eric, perhaps you could just speak with them afterwards. I have a couple of comments very quickly to make, and one is that I remember in the summer of 1973 when I was in my late teens, going down to my mother's American side of the family in downstate Vermont, and good Republicans, all these people, lamenting the decline of the United States in global affairs. My uncles were basically saying that the U.S. is done. We have nothing left to offer. We're in recession, depression. So what that then and of course we've had a couple more since then. And you suggest you're not optimistic now, and maybe the world is changing into a plurilateral sort of system. Maybe that's true. We'll see how it works out. But it seems like Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain's comment about reading his obituary in the New York Times was, the accounts of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Perhaps that's how it will be with the United States too. We'll see in the fullness of time, I guess. But that's why history, of course, is so wonderful. As a historian, I can say that. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I'd just like to shout out as well to Sabrina Hutchison and Janet James up at the back who organized this. Although it runs seamlessly, of course, it's it's due to their work that it does run seamlessly to everything that's put on here. So thanks very much for that. Also, thank you, Eric, for coming and presenting your talk. It was absolutely fascinating. And thank you to everybody for coming today. And the next one of these will be in the fall of 2015. So, of course, we look forward to everybody returning and listening to whatever great speaker we have at that point. As yet, under TBD, I guess, is how they say it. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot, Eric. And anybody who wants to ask Eric.
Yeah, I'm happy to
questions.
ask questions, answer questions. If yeah.